Establishing central control immediately, this pawn grab signals an intent for a solid, potentially positional game. Developing the knight towards the center immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for flexible pawn breaks later. Developing the knight reinforces central control and prepares for kingside castling while keeping options open. Challenging white's central pawn structure immediately, c5 creates dynamic pawn play and aims for counterplay on the queenside. Embracing central space, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure, aiming for a dynamic imbalance where pawn advances and piece activity become paramount. Black liberates the c-pawn, creating dynamic central imbalances and opening lines for pieces to target white's king. Recapturing the pawn with the knight immediately repositions the piece towards the center, seizing crucial squares and preparing for future kingside action. Opening the diagonal for the queen and preparing to develop the king's bishop adds crucial piece activity. Opening the diagonal for the queen and solidifying the center, this move prepares for knight development and potential kingside castling. Bringing the knight into the center solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for kingside development, creating a dynamic pawn structure. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for kingside castling, this bishop maneuver aims to bring another piece into the game's developmental chorus, creating a harmonious battery with the queen and indirectly influencing the d5 square, should the opportunity arise to challenge black's queenside setup. Initiating central contact immediately strikes at white's pawn structure, aiming to disrupt their harmonious development and potentially create an isolated queen pawn for white if exchanges occur. Re-establishing central control and developing a key piece, this knight now eyes the enemy pawn structure, ready to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's dynamic central push. Instantly challenging the center, this bishop's deployment establishes active piece play and threatens white's knight, forcing a decision and potentially unlocking attacking avenues while subtly preparing for a pawn break. Castling here securely tucks the king away, a crucial preparatory step before initiating pawn breaks or piece attacks, while simultaneously activating the rook for potential central or queenside involvement later in the game. Releasing the central tension with this exchange, black bravely simplifies, accepting a slightly less active piece structure for the moment, yet crucially preventing white from building a dominant pawn center. Observe how this concession subtly shifts the battleground toward piece play and the control of open lines. Opening the e-file for rook activity, this recapture fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating an isolated d-pawn for white while eliminating a key black defender. The resulting tension in the center, especially with pawns now facing each other, will demand careful piece maneuvering. Opening the diagonal for the queen and developing a pawn forward creates immediate contact and potential for exchange, aiming to simplify the position while challenging white's central pawn structure. Developing the bishop here, a seemingly quiet repositioning, actually exerts crucial pressure along the long diagonal and prepares to support a potential central pawn push, while also eyeing the now potentially exposed black king. The knight embarks on an ambitious journey, aiming to dislodge the powerful white bishop from its commanding diagonal and potentially threaten the queen's pawn. This maneuver initiates a fascinating positional struggle where piece activity will be paramount, and control of the central squares will shift dynamically with each exchange. Liberating the bishop from its defensive post, this recapture opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares to contest the now open d-file, potentially ushering in an active middle game where piece play and pawn structure dynamics will be paramount. The knight's capture, by eliminating white's strong bishop on c4, strategically clears the d6 square for black's potential queen or rook deployment, and directly confronts white's central pawn majority, aiming to disrupt its cohesiveness and create weaknesses. Unveiling a potent tactical surprise, this forcing check aims to disrupt black's king's safety and potentially trap the intruding knight, creating a dynamic shift in the game's landscape. Unyielding defense solidifies the black king's sanctuary, gracefully rerouting the bishop to a more secure outpost, thereby initiating a quiet repositioning that prepares for potential future pawn advances on the queen side. Asserting control over the open d-file and initiating a central pawn push are the immediate consequences of capturing the bishop. Consolidating the bishop's position onto the c6 square offers black improved coordination, aiming to bolster the pawn on c4 and potentially set up future pressure along the c-file. It's a quiet but important step in the ongoing positional struggle. A subtle bid for central space and piece activity, aiming to leverage the slightly exposed black bishop. Pursuing the initiative, black redirects the queen to a more active square, eyeing the queenside and threatening to disrupt white's central pawn structure if they overextend. Recapturing on c5 with the queen immediately addresses the exposed g2 pawn and brings the queen to a more central, active square, ready to support advances or defend against black's developing threats. Exchanging queens here precipitates an endgame where black's initiative, built through dynamic piece play, evaporates, leaving them with a slightly worse pawn structure and a passive bishop. Seizing the open c-file with the rook establishes crucial control, a foundational element for any looming endgame scenario, where file dominance often dictates the rhythm of play and potential breakthroughs. Sensing an opportunity to seize space on the queen side, black ventures a pawn advance, aiming to create a more active presence for the pieces stationed there. Securing the d-file now allows white to activate the remaining rook, preparing for potential pressure on the open file and coordinating with the queen in a central outpost. Initiating a pawn advance on the king side at this juncture, black seeks to create potential counterplay and perhaps free the h-pawn, but it simultaneously weakens the dark squares around the king, offering white a target for future pressure. The immediate positional consequence is a slight loosening of black's defensive structure, creating a potential rift that white could exploit with well-placed pieces. Fortifying the kingside pawn chain, this move shores up the territory but concurrently creates a permanent weakness on g3. A knight repositions, seeking a more active central presence after the queens have exited, aiming to participate in the upcoming pawn structure dynamics and potentially attack weaknesses on the kingside or in the center. Positioning the bishop to e3 now creates a subtle, yet important, rerouting possibility. It aims to redeploy to a more active square, perhaps g5 or even f4, to pressure black's slightly awkward knight on d7, and to prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. The bishop's previous post on d4 was less effective after the exchange of queens, and this repositioning subtly enhances white's piece harmony while keeping a watchful eye on the weakened c-file. The knight embarks on an ambitious sortie, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially land on a more active square, perhaps c6 or even d3, while also clearing the path for the c-pawn to advance. A clever maneuver redirects the bishop, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward positioning of black's knight on e5 and potentially create new attacking avenues on the queenside or center. Sensing a shift towards a less congested center, black repositions their knight, aiming to free the besieged bishop on c6 and explore activity on the kingside. Solidifying control over the central light squares and preparing to develop the queenside pawns for future expansion, white aims to restrict black's knight on e5. This prophylactic maneuver prevents any immediate kingside threats and sets the stage for a more comfortable middle game. Initiating a gradual build-up on the kingside, the rook anchors itself on the g-file, creating the potential for future pressure against white's castled monarch by potentially swinging over to the h-file or supporting pawn advancements. Securing the knight's central influence and preparing for potential kingside activity by this bishop repositioning is a sensible way to fortify the position. The knight repositions, seeking a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create threats on the kingside. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure is the primary objective here, preventing black from exploiting the vulnerable f3 square and establishing an outpost for their knight. This pawn advance signals white's intention to solidify their position and prepare for potential central action or a slow grind. By playing f3, white addresses a lingering concern about kingside safety, creating a more robust defensive shield. The move sacrifices immediate dynamic potential for a more secure, albeit passive, pawn structure. This action creates a new pawn chain, dictating the flow of potential pawn breaks and restricting black's immediate tactical options. Consider this a defensive reinforcement aimed at controlling key squares and preventing black's knight from finding a comfortable resting place. The knight's journey to g6 cleverly sidesteps the pawn chain's immediate influence, preparing to reroute to a more active square like f4 or h4, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure and potentially disrupting white's coordinated pieces. Refortifying the diagonal, this offers the bishop a more active role, aiming to pressure black's knight and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, subtly hinting at a future kingside expansion while maintaining solid central control. The knight embarks on an intriguing journey, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps outflank the bishop on f2. This advance generates a fascinating tension on the queenside, hinting at a potential pawn break or a maneuver to control open lines that might soon emerge. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on its developed square aims to coordinate a firmer grip on the central squares, particularly the advanced e3 outpost, and prepares for potential future pawn pushes on the kingside. Pondering the repositioning of the knight from f4 to d5, a subtle but significant shift occurs, aiming to undermine white's central pawn structure. This cavalry maneuver seeks to exploit the potential weaknesses around white's d4 and c5 pawns, creating dynamic possibilities and potentially opening lines for black's rooks. It's a move that breathes new life into black's position, moving away from the static repetition and seeking a more active, complex middle game. Observe how this centralized knight might now influence the d-file and the c-file simultaneously, a dual threat that demands white's careful attention. This knight's journey isn't just about reaching a new square. It's a strategic declaration of intent to disrupt the current equilibrium and force white into reactive play. Initiating a queen's pawn game now opens the d-file, presenting white with opportunities to exploit black's slightly exposed king. The knight's relocation creates a dynamic imbalance, allowing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside later if black isn't careful about their piece activity. Reclaiming the pawn on d5 solidifies black's central presence and aims to disrupt white's initiated pawn structure, creating a dynamic pawn island that requires careful monitoring from white's forces. Initiating control over the crucial d-file is the primary objective here, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially launch an attack on the kingside later. Seeking to solidify its position and prepare for future action, black's king ventures outward, aiming to escape the cramped central files and find a safer haven on the queenside, potentially preparing to challenge white's central pawn control. Unlocking the c-file, white aims to activate their rook aggressively, potentially creating battery threats or aiming for a breakthrough against black's somewhat passive pawn structure. Bringing the monarch closer to the center, a bold declaration of the king's readiness for the endgame. Fortifying the c-file now solidifies control and prepares for potential advances or piece transfers, aiming to restrict black's counterplay and improve white's piece coordination towards the center. Solidifying the knight's presence and preparing for a potential pawn push along the kingside, this squares away a crucial defender for the g6 knight and asserts a more grounded defensive posture, albeit at the cost of some kingside pawn mobility. Initiating a pawn thrust in the center to challenge black's knight and potentially create attacking opportunities. This is a sensible regrouping, bringing the rook to a more active position along the open d-file, aiming to contest the central control and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Liberating the monarch from its central post, this maneuver prepares to reorient the king towards the queenside, aiming to shield it from potential pawn advances and position it for a more active role in the endgame. Probing for weaknesses on the queenside, black's pawn pushes with a4, threatening to create a passed pawn or disrupt white's pawn structure, aiming to exploit the potentially exposed queenside pawns. Asserting dominance on the queenside, the rook spearheads into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's nascent counterplay and exploit the open file. Centralizing the rook after the exchange simplifies the position significantly, preparing to contest the open a file and potentially creating an outpost for the knight. The doubling of pawns on the c-file, a consequence of the capture, presents a curious structural imbalance as white immediately resolves the immediate material deficit by recapturing with the pawn. This creates a passed pawn on the c-file, albeit a backward one for now, and opens the b-file for white's rook, potentially leading to future pressure down that flank. Black's knight, having been forced to retreat after its adventurous foray, now finds itself in a relatively passive position. The immediate task for white is to activate their remaining pieces and exploit the pawn structure that has emerged from the recent exchanges, aiming to create weaknesses in black's setup. Capturing the pawn on a 2 opens a fascinating new avenue for black, fundamentally altering the piece interactions and immediately injecting a dose of tactical complexity into what was shaping up to be a relatively static position. This ambitious grab, though seemingly simple, forces white to react, and crucially, sacrifices black's own central control for immediate material gain and potential piece activity. Consider the implications for white's rook on the file. It's now under direct threat, and its free movement is curtailed, potentially allowing black to exploit the open file. The long-term consequences of this pawn's acquisition will hinge on whether black can effectively coordinate their remaining forces to support this advanced pawn, or if white can strategically isolate and neutralize this new attacker. Reclaiming the open column now prioritizes the rook's influence, aiming to challenge black's newly acquired outpost with a centralizing maneuver. Bringing the bishop back to d5 allows it to defend the crucial pawn on c4 and opens up the possibility of a future exchange that could simplify the position. This strategic repositioning aims to shore up weak points and prepare for a more dynamic phase of the game, perhaps by activating the rook on g8 or maneuvering the knight to a more central square. Targeting the isolated pawn on a7 with the rook now intensifies pressure on black's already compromised queenside structure. Shifting the rook to the open file aims to activate it, but it momentarily surrenders the initiative and allows white's rook to establish a commanding presence on the file, potentially creating future threats along the queenside or preparing for pawn advances. The rook's repositioning to b4 aims to establish dominance on the open b-file, threatening to infiltrate black's territory and create further positional pressure. A subtle maneuver to reroute the rook, aiming to secure the queenside pawns and potentially create an outpost for the knight on c4. Initiating a pawn advance on the kingside to secure the bishop's outpost and potentially create breathing room for further activity. This cautious step aims to shore up white's structure on the right flank, preventing black's knight from finding a more comfortable square to re-enter the fray, and also preparing to support a potential pawn push down the road, perhaps to liberate the rook. It's a move focused on solidifying existing advantages and gradually improving piece placement rather than a sharp, immediate tactical shot. Navigating the cluttered queenside, black's monarch ventures towards the center, aiming to leverage the slight inactivity of white's pieces and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece repositioning in this tense, maneuvering phase. Opening up a diagonal for the bishop to potentially cause trouble on the queenside after the pawn push. Clearing the path for the rook to potentially infiltrate on the file creates a positional imbalance, though the knight's subsequent repositioning offers some defensive cover. Repositioning the bishop to its prior square signals a shift in white's intent from aggressive pawn disruption to a more patient accumulation of positional advantages, eyeing the weakness on a6 and potential pressure along the central files. Reclaiming the pawn on a4 is a sound positional recovery, neutralizing white's extra material and bringing the queenside pawn structure back into balance. Rallying the rook to the open file aims to exert pressure on the queenside pawns and potentially create counterplay against black's exposed king. The bishop aims for the more active square on a4, seeking to contest the control of the long diagonal and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Reclaiming the open file, the rook initiates a positional regrouping, aiming to either pressure black's isolated pawn on a4 or find a more active placement on the third rank. Relocating the rook to the open 8th rank promises to contest white's newfound space advantage along the file, aiming to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces and potentially exploit the currently undefended pawn on a3. Seizing the opened b-file with the rook now allows for potential harassment of black's queenside pawns, while also preparing to contest control of that open file should black attempt to reinforce it. Reclaiming the b-file is a sensible aim, aiming to challenge white's control after the queens were traded and the pawn structure became somewhat fragmented. This maneuver prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queen side or a redistribution of forces to aid the rook if it can find active squares. Repositioning the rook allows white to eye potential weaknesses on the queen side and consolidate their queenside pawn majority, preparing for a controlled advance that could restrict black's king activity.